Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Welcome to the State of the Union edition as President Trump prepares to deliver his address to a joint session of Congress tonight at a critical time for his presidency and the nation. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We're in for the long haul and glad you're with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. His sixth address, Kailey, to a joint session. He set a record last year, and he's projecting that he might do it again tonight.
Yeah, he warns us the speech will be long because he has a lot to talk about. Remembering last year, his speech to a joint session was 99 minutes, so perhaps we'll talk that record. And when we consider what he has to talk about, there are a lot of headwinds working against this president right now. He was just dealt a blow by the Supreme Court on his tariff policy. Those justices will be sat right before him as he delivers a speech in the well of the House. Then, of course, you have the fact that he's underwater on his two strongest issues, at least in the last election, the economy and immigration. And he's going to have to message to the American people to try to turn that around.
All of that starting at 9 p.m. Eastern time with America watching. He had more than 36 million people tune in last year for the joint session. We have every reason to believe that there could be even more interest this year because of all the reasons that you just listed, Kailey, and we don't know what he's going to say about a potential war in Iran. So we've lined up some important voices for you to get ready for the speech tonight. We've got a long day of coverage that's rolling right now.
Yep, we have this hour. We'll see you again at 5 p.m. And then, of course, special coverage begins at 8 p.m. Eastern time. But this hour, we'll bring you a conversation with the former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence, who obviously knows this president particularly well, having served in the first administration. Marc will be with us in just a moment. But we begin, as always, with a check on the markets. And for that, we turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. Here's what's going on. Very different tone to the market from yesterday's rout. Tech's leading the way higher right now, right to the numbers with the S&P up 53 at 68.91. That is a gain of 0.8%. The Dow up 426, now up 0.9. Nasdaq Composite up 239, up by 1.1%. 10-year 4.02%. Gold down 1.2%, 51.65 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6, 65.92 a barrel. And Bitcoin now lower by 0.5%, 64,200 on Bitcoin. Warner Brothers Discovery is considering a new takeover bid from Paramount Skydance. Paramount shares lower by 1.1%. WBD up by 0.9%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We here in Washington are obviously gearing up for a long night, a night that could go into the wee hours of the morning, I guess, potentially, depending on how long President Trump's speech and how long it takes Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger to deliver the Democratic response afterward. Knowing both speeches, the speech from the president and the response, are likely to be centered around the questions of affordability and the economy. It's what Abigail Spanberger ran on in the election she won in the off-year cycle last November. And President Trump, of course, is going to want to try to sell his economy and his economic policies, like tariffs, though they have had to be altered slightly in recent days, as he did when he addressed a joint session at the beginning of his presidency last year.
For every one new regulation, 10 old regulations must be eliminated. The next phase of our plan to deliver the greatest economy in history is for this Congress to pass tax cuts for everybody. And I have also imposed a 25% tariff on foreign aluminum, copper, lumber, and steel. Tariffs are about making America rich again and making America great again, and it's happening, and it will happen rather quickly. There'll be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that.
Of course, it was a great disturbance, now known as Liberation Day, and the markets were not okay with that. And it turns out the Supreme Court was not okay with the tariffs either following the ruling on Friday. We're curious to know what the president will project when it comes to the future of tariffs, but there are so many other issues, as we've already established, that he will get his hands on tonight. It's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall. On the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, we start at the White House, where the president is having his annual State of the Union luncheon in the building behind Tyler. And of course, Tyler, this will ramp up to the guests arriving and the motorcade procession to Capitol Hill this evening. Are we hearing anything from the White House about what he plans to say?
Well, Joe, it is our understanding at this point that the White House is really looking to use tonight to refocus the narrative when it comes to the economy. And as you and Kailey have already outlined, it's really an issue that they've been playing defense over. You had Cliff Young of Ipsos on the show earlier this week, a few days ago, as new polling from Ipsos finds that 57% of U.S. adults disapprove of the president's handling when it comes to the economy. That's why we're expecting the president tonight to tout a slew of policies that have already been enacted, such as those higher refunds under the One Big Beautiful Bill, as well as proposals that he would like to see enacted, such as his plan when it comes to health care, urging Congress likely tonight to codify his plan that would move federal subsidies from insurance companies to American consumers. So expect things like that. I'll throw another one at you. The Wall Street Journal reporting that we could hear a stronger commitment from big tech companies when it comes to taking off some of that electricity cost related to Americans and AI and data centers. But you really hit it there at the top of the program. It is tariffs that are going to be overshadowing the remarks tonight. Sitting front and center are going to be those key Supreme Court justices that overturned his tariffs related to IEEPA. And Joe and Kailey, perhaps that's where we can thread domestic and foreign policy. We know that White House aides have repeatedly said they want the president to focus on those domestic issues as we head into the midterms. But we are, of course, also expecting the president to talk about foreign policy plans, particularly as we see tensions rise between the U.S. and Iran.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And we'll be checking in with Tyler throughout the day into the evening as President Trump prepares to make his way to the Capitol later on tonight. Thank you. And as we consider what President Trump will say in this address to a joint session and to the nation, we turn now to someone who has a little bit of insight into that subject. Former Director of Legislative Affairs in the first Trump administration, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence. Marc Short is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Welcome back to Bloomberg
Thanks for having me back.
Radio.
Good to see you, Marc.
So we know President Trump likes to weave. He sometimes veers off topic in speeches that he's not delivering to a joint session. How do you expect him to stick or veer from the script tonight?
Well, I think he does veer more frequently when he's at a rally audience than actually at the State of the Union. I think he does typically stay a little bit stronger to the speech, but he wants his speechwriters to put everything in there, and I don't think he's going to feel constrained by time. So I don't think that's a suggestion that it's not going to be long. I'm simply saying I think it's going to be more according to the script.
Is this day as important as it has been for so many years in Washington? When I think Marc Short, I think traditional Republican institutionalist, right? This is a big deal. It's the Super Bowl of politics. And the conversation that you used to have straddling both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue would be imperative to setting the agenda for the year ahead. Is it still as important as it was?
Yes, but I'd say it's a different audience.
Yeah?
I think the reality is there's going to be very little done in Congress. So he's not really speaking to the members who are in
that's important.
The hall. He's speaking to the American people. And I think the president understands the environment. He understands big moments. He understands the 250th anniversary of our republic. Yeah. And I think you'll hear him talk about that. But he'll be speaking to the American people about what he plans to do for affordability. Mm-hmm. I think there's very little he's going to get done in this Congress. And I think, sadly, some of the proposals he can put forward, frankly, will get done more likely after the Democrats win in the midterms. Like when you talk about price controls for drugs, he's not going to have enough Republicans to do that right now. But that may be something he gets done after the midterms.
Well, as you say, he's speaking to the American people. Polling shows the American people are not satisfied right now with the job largely that he's doing on the economy, on the issue of affordability. His approval rating is the worst we've seen so far in his second term. Can he say anything tonight really to turn that around?
I think he can. I don't think he will. I think the reality is that his two issues that helped propel him back to the presidency were immigration and border control and the economy and inflation, and they're both negative for him now. And I think that he actually has a lot he can build on, from extending tax relief. Markets have been roughly at all-time highs, but I think his trade agenda he's not going to turn back on, and that's what's unpopular. And he's going to continue to dig down further into that despite the ruling last week. And on the border, the border crossings are down, but you've seen the way that some elements of DHS have handled the removal in such a ham-fisted way that people are not happy with that either.
Well, so here we have a president speaking with the Department of Homeland Security shut down. It is a curious scenario, and I'm sure he's going to talk about this. But I wonder, Marc, if you expect any more nuance from him. We saw that one sheet that the administration sent to Democrats on Capitol Hill, and it talked about the changes that had been made, not just body cameras, but the way officers were identifying themselves, no demasking, but there was a long list of what the administration believes it has steps it has taken to try to make Democrats happier here. This is a president, we're told, that wants to make a deal on this. Will we hear more from him than we have?
I think you'll probably hear him begrudge Democrats for not getting a deal done.
Yeah,
I think they have made significant movement. I think putting Tom Homan in charge and having said Tom Homan's reporting to me, not to Kristi Noem, reporting to me as the president was a significant change. And so I think there's been a lot of concessions the administration has given Democrats. I think sadly Democrats feel like they won the last shutdown, and so they're not worried about the political ramifications of trying to do it again.
Well, Kristi Noem, presumably, I don't believe she's going to be the designated survivor. Do we know who that
don't
is
know
yet?
yet.
Not in advance.
Ask Marc
Will
if he knew.
be there in the chamber in front of President Trump. Right across the aisle will be the justices of the Supreme Court who just ruled against the president on tariffs, as you were alluding to earlier. Do you expect the president will say anything directly to Chief Justice John Roberts or any of the justices assembled there?
I think he will. I think he will want to talk certainly about the reason why he thinks he's right on trade policy. And I think he really believes that in many cases, beyond the economic impact, he thinks it helps him in leverage on national security issues. And he's going to make that case. But I think he's far more comfortable being more of an attack dog online than he is in person. And so I don't think
different when you have to make eye contact.
Yes, so it's like look when he did the whole tour with Jerome Powell at the Fed, right? Yeah.
Sure.
You read all the tweets he put out, but then when you actually see him in person, it's friendly. Look at Mamdani and what he actually has Mamdani into the White House, and so when he's actually engaged right in front of somebody, he's less comfortable actually having the same hits as he is on his phone.
Talk to us about Iran. We understand that Marco Rubio is briefing, and there are reports now. Axios says the CIA director is going to be part of this briefing as well for lawmakers at the White House ahead of the speech tonight. Are they going to Congress with an ask, or is this simply the information we have, the president will decide when he's ready?
I think the latter. I don't think they feel they need to ask Congress for anything, but it's more of a courtesy update of where things stand. I think that from the president's negotiations perspective, Iran likes to drag administrations along. They've been doing that for 50 years now. But I think the president has kind of drawn a red line here. And
could we hear him announce the beginning of strikes in a State of the Union address?
I would suspect that there will be strikes. I do think that, but I'm not sure it'll be announced tonight.
Well, and what will it signal if, even if they're not announced, he dedicates a certain amount of the State of the Union speech to geopolitics, knowing that when he came back into office, he said he was doing so when he was running for election again on an America First agenda?
Well, I think, frankly, he should. I think that his policies, what he did in Venezuela was remarkable. I think his strikes on Iran were good. I think standing with Israel has been good. I think, sadly, a departure that is on the 4-year anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine is where he's been weak. But I think he has several successes he can talk about. And so I think he should.
Is that what his base wants him to be talking about?
I think his base is more supportive of him as a person than perhaps a set of ideals. And so I don't think you see much blowback from the base regarding what happened in Venezuela or Iran.
Yeah, interesting. We talked to Don Bacon last evening, which is a really interesting moment to be talking to this Republican who has crossed the president on issues including tariffs. And we asked him about how many members of the conference he speaks for. And I'm wondering what you're hearing. I know you're in touch with a lot of these same people you used to work with. Did the Supreme Court give the Republican conference hope that they might not have to deal with this tariff issue straight through the midterms?
I don't know about that. I think that the Supreme Court ruling was an important one because it's an important constitutional precedent. But I think it was always clear the president, regardless of the outcome, was going to move forward with his trade agenda. And if any Republican was thinking that the Supreme Court would save them from having to address this, that was foolhardy.
Interesting.
I think the president's going to continue down this path, and he'll likely be calling on Congress to stand with him. And I think there's plenty of Republicans who are hoping the court would take care of that so they wouldn't have to take a stand.
Well, we also spoke last night with the chair of the Budget Committee in the House, Jody Arrington, who was gung-ho on the idea of a second budget reconciliation package that could in part codify the president's tariffs into law. Do you see any real prospect of another reconciliation package making it through this Congress?
Not at all.
He's smiling.
but I mean,
he can't even take the question seriously.
But as chairman of the Budget Committee, Jody Arrington has to put out that hope, or else there's like less relevancy to his committee. And, that helps him with a lot of things as far as raising resources in this town to put out the hope there'll be a second reconciliation. And for the administration, they want to talk about that too. Mm-hmm. So I would hear them talk about that and the president call on Congress to do it. I just think the margin for House Republicans has only gotten smaller. Yep. And as you said, the president's numbers continue to decline heading into a midterm. So there's going to be very little, I think, appetite for Republicans to actually take on another big legislative bill this year.
Really interesting. I thought the chairman was going to send Kailey flowers when she asked him about it. Marc, thank you for being here on a State of the Union Day. Great pleasure to spend some time with Marc Short live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Chairman of Advancing American Freedom, of course, used to run Leg Affairs in the first Trump administration and was Mike Pence's chief of staff. Let's assemble our political panel. We're going to take a couple of swings today with Rick and Jeanne, including right now Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. She is our Democratic analyst, I should say, and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. Jeanne, which Donald Trump shows up tonight? Is this a victory lap or a retribution speech?
I think Susie Wiles and his team would like nothing more than for him to focus on affordability. I agree with Marc Short. You look back, I looked back at his State of the Unions. This is somebody who's much more experienced than we sometimes give him credit for at giving these speeches. He does stick to prompter, although you just imagine what's ringing in his head, these poll numbers and those kinds of things. I heard him yesterday talk about the fact that he said something like, I suffer for the country with these fake polls. So I think some of that's going to be ringing in his head. So I think he sticks to prompter. I think he focuses on affordability. But you never know with Donald Trump. And that's quite frankly why some people like him so much.
Well, so when we hear from the president tonight, Rick, is it a president that's on offense or a president that's on the defensive? I think we're having a little bit of difficulty with Rick's audio there. Jeanne, I guess I could ask you the same question. As you talk about the idea that he's underwater on what are supposed to be his strongest issues, his approval rating right now is the poorest it has been in his second term. Is he going to have to spend more time defending himself than outlining a future vision for the remaining 3 years of his presidency?
Yeah, I mean, what he ideally should do is say, look at all the things, and he does have some positive things to talk about economically. Look at what I've done and look at all the things, Kailey, that we're going to do going forward. But Donald Trump is, not somebody to apologize. He's not somebody to rethink what he has done. He's more somebody to boast and to try to bring people along with him and to go on the attack against his opponents. So I think there's going to be a little bit of inner battle we may see in this 100+ minute speech, Kailey, with Donald Trump, him having sort of a chokehold by Susie Wiles is where he should be going and what he really wants to burst out and say. But what he should do is he really should say, this is what I've done, and this is where we are going, and things will be brighter next time I'm up here.
We've got about a minute here. Rick Davis, what's your expectation?
Yeah, I think more defiant than anything. It's been a bit of a battle with him in the last month. We've talked about it already on the program, dropping poll numbers, defeat in the Supreme Court, some pushback from Republicans. And it's almost like he's fighting more his own team than he's fighting Democrats. And I think that defiance is going to come out in spades tonight. I think he's going to push back on everybody. He really thinks he's a government of one and wants it to be that way. And so I don't think he's going to let any daylight into cooperating with Congress. He's going to give him some of his demands. He's going to push back on the Supreme Court. I'm pretty confident there'll be a moment there. And I think the unifying aspects will be talking about, Erica Kirk political violence in the stands and the gold-winning men's hockey team. So there'll be moments of light, but I think you're going to see a defiant president who believes that he's done all the right things.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel today. They'll be back with us for more in just a few minutes. Out on the other side of our conversation with Republican Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina. He's going to be joining us next right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. counting down the hours until the State of the Union address from President Trump, of course, expected to begin around 9 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be bringing you special coverage here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we look forward to what is expected to be a lengthy speech from the president covering a variety of different issues, largely probably his economic policy and potentially foreign policy as well. But of course, your view on what the president is likely to say or your reception to the way in which he says it probably depends on what side of the aisle you're on. Certainly, when we spoke with Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware on Balance of Power yesterday, he didn't seem too enthusiastic about the president's speech tonight. This is what he told us.
Tomorrow night is the State of the Union address, and I'll predict for you what President Trump is not going to say. He's not going to say, I imposed a tax on all Americans that raised your cost of living. He's not going to say, I have a clear plan for what we're going to do in the Middle East in order to get Iran to stop its nuclear program. He's not going to say, I think Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, and on the 4th anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, I'm going to stand with Zelensky and all of our European allies and finally force Putin to the table. He's not going to say, I'm taking responsibility for appearing in the Epstein files more than 30,000 times and finally coming clean about his relationship with Epstein and his role in dragging out the release of these files. I do not expect to hear any of those things from President Trump tomorrow night.
That is the Democratic framing of the speech that will be tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern. And of course, we'll bring it to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Let's talk to someone else who's going to be in the chamber who I'm sure has very high expectations for this address. Senator Ted Budd, the Republican from North Carolina, joins us right now on State of the Union Day. And Senator, it's great to have you with us, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm compelled by your guest this evening, the fire chief of Batcave. Chief Freeman is going to join you for the State of the Union address, which reminds us that all news is local in your business, Senator. I'm wondering what you're hearing from people in your state. What do people in North Carolina want to hear the president talk about? Do they want more tariffs? Do they want masked ICE agents? Do they want something new from the president? What do you want to hear tonight?
What people in North Carolina want is more opportunity. If it's like the chief that's coming in from Batcave, and we're so glad to have him as a guest tonight. He's going to hear that he is, along with everybody in the 25 western counties, remembered by President Trump. When you see the Democrats who did not vote to extend DHS funding and essentially shut it down, they're not just shutting down ICE like they think about. They're shutting down DHS, they're shutting down FEMA, they're shutting down TSA, they're shutting down the Coast Guard, and that's irresponsible. And to my colleague, respectfully, and by the way, you think about divisions here in Washington, D.C., we get along as far as riding in elevators and occasional friendships, but we could not agree more on policy. I mean, this is a president who was overwhelmingly elected by the American people, and he is living up to his promises. And Trump won, and Trump, President 2, when in his second term, he's got a whiteboard. He's marking these promises off. And so when he says he wants more opportunity for the American people, he's doing that. If that's tariffs and if that's funding for people in Western North Carolina, that's what he's concerned about.
Well, the American people, Senator, may have elected the president. Thank you for being here with us today. Yet polling consistently shows they are not necessarily happy with the job that he's doing now that he's back in office. A 60% disapproval rating, Senator, when you consider the fact that there is a Senate seat up for grabs in your state of North Carolina. Does that kind of number not concern you as we get closer to the midterms?
Well, you think about hockey, and I think we're going to have some special guests for hockey tonight. You always want to skate where
Indeed.
The puck is going. And if you look at what the One Big Beautiful Bill or the working families tax cut, that President Trump supported, that's going to put more money back in people's pockets. And what Trump was very smart to do in this term is to work on taxes right out of the gate. The Democrats could not be more opposed to this. But President Trump gave them the largest tax in recent history, largest tax cut in recent history, and the Democrats voted for the largest tax increase in recent history. So I think people are going to start feeling more money in their pocket. They want to know that there's certainty, that they're safe, and that's what President Trump's doing, whether it's international or whether it's in someone's hometown. I think President Trump's policies are what are making more money and are putting more money in people's pockets.
You serve on some important committees, Senator, as we remind our audience, including the Armed Services Committee. What are you hearing about the president's plans for Iran? We know that there's another round of talks set for Thursday. President has reportedly been considering a bloody nose strike to increase leverage at the table. That would suggest the potential for a strike in the next 24 to 48 hours. Do you believe that he would announce strikes against Iran tonight?
I wouldn't put a timeline on the president. I think the president is operating in good faith. He's doing everything he can to come to a peaceful resolution to end the Ayatollah regime that's been there since 1979. It's slaughtered its own people. He is standing with the Iranian freedom lovers and against this awful regime which chants death to America and death to our allies. So I think he's giving them a chance. If you look at the precision of the strike with Operation Midnight Hammer last summer, I think that's what he wants. He does not want to send American troops into harm's way, but the bottom line is to protect American life, and that's what he wants to do. If he feels there's a threat or that Iran, which chants death to America, has a nuclear threat, then he'll take action. But again, he wants to give peace a chance, and that's exactly what he's doing.
Well, if he opts for something beyond just a precision strike, if this turns into a more durable, prolonged conflict, does he need to ask your permission as a United States Senator, the permission of the United States Congress?
If it's prolonged, but I don't think that's what President Trump wants. He does not want American boots on the ground. He likes precise, decisive victories like we saw with Operation Midnight Hammer, like we saw with in Venezuela in January. So I think he wants quick action, no boots on the ground, and a decisive win for American forces and the American people.
Secretary of State and the CIA director, as I'm sure you well know, Senator, are briefing the Gang of Eight on Iran today at the White House. Do you have a sense of what they are going to learn, or will they bring you information that you might not have seen or heard yet?
No, I think they want the latest. Are we seeing, and one of the things we've seen is that money is starting to flow out of the country. And I think that just shows how dishonest the Iranian leaders are for their own people, and also shows them that they're very scared of American forces and our precise strike capabilities. So we're going to learn more, but again, that's contained among representative a group of 8, and I think they're going to get all that they need to know. But again, you don't want to disseminate that too further, and you want to preserve the right for the president to do what he needs to do.
All right, Senator, thank you so much for joining us on this State of the Union Day. Republican Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina here with us on Balance of Power. And for reaction to that interview and more on how geopolitics could factor into the speech tonight, we turn back to our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are still with us. So, Rick, we know that the president campaigned for election on the idea of America first, on an agenda that was supposed to be more focused on domestic issues than what's gone on internationally. The last few months have seemed to be the reverse of that. So how do you expect the president to message, if he decides to do it at all, his reasoning behind being more interventionist, whether it's in the Western Hemisphere and in places like Venezuela or in the Middle East?
Well, it's certainly well within, his capacity to articulate this Western Hemisphere strategy that the administration put out just a few months ago. And I think that's been relatively well received, both by the American people and by experts who believe that security in our own hemisphere is a tantamount in importance. That being said, it is a little interesting that the candidate, Donald Trump, who spent virtually his entire campaign talking about the evils of engagement, very reminiscent of our very first president 250 years ago, George. Anyway, so yes, we would thoroughly expect this to be a speech around how he can get out of the box on his America First agenda. The economy, tariffs, these are things that are polling the worst he's ever had in his political career, and he needs to resurrect that if he really wants to make a run for Republicans in the midterm elections.
Mm-hmm. Jeanne, there are a lot of things that Democrats would like to shine a light on this evening, including the Epstein scandal. We're going to see a room with Democratic lawmakers who in some cases have brought victims of Jeffrey Epstein to the House this evening. There have been several revelations over the past couple of weeks invoking names like Howard Lutnick and Donald Trump. I'm sure he's not going to talk about this, but when you consider the various Democratic responses, not just the official one from Abigail Spanberger, but the progressive response, the Spanish language response, how does the party try to break through the administration's messaging tonight?
You know, I think number one rule for Democrats tonight, and you hear this from Hakeem Jeffries, you hear it from Chuck Schumer, is do no harm. This administration's poll numbers are at January 6 lows. The president is frustrated by them, rightly so. They are underwater. The two top issues that got him elected, the most important being the economy and also immigration. So the worst thing Democrats could do is do anything to draw attention to themselves. So it's the old adage, do no harm. Beyond that, I think we're going to hear from Spanberger and the litany of Democrats beyond her who are going to be speaking about chaos and costs. And I think as it pertains to Jeffrey Epstein, we're going to hear a message, not necessarily about this story that won't die, but about promises the president made and didn't keep. He promised to release all the Epstein files. This is important to his base. He hasn't done that. And what you were just talking with to Rick about, this issue of interventionism, as Kailey was talking about it, he promised no endless wars, no intervening. He made the promise and he has broken it. So I think that's the context in which Democrats were gingerly approach that. But by and large, this has got to be from Democrats, do no harm, economy, cost of living, affordability.
Indeed, as Jeanne mentions, Hakeem Jeffries warning members against unforced errors at the State of the Union tonight. We'll find out in real time what everyone has in mind. With the help of our panel, they're going to be here too. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis in for the long haul. So fasten your chin strap. What will the president say about AI tonight? Will he address the meeting today at the Pentagon with Anthropic? We're going to have a special conversation ahead with Gregory Allen at CSIS next.
If it were any other day, other than being State of the Union Day, we probably would have dedicated a lot more time already this hour to a meeting that took place at the Pentagon today between the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, and the CEO of Anthropic. What's in question here is Claude and its cooperation or lack thereof with the DoD when it comes to concerns that at least Anthropic has around safeguards around its AI modeling. Apparently, the Defense Secretary, this is according to reporting from Axios, gave Anthropic until Friday evening to give the military unfettered access to its AI model or face harsh penalties. The harsh penalties we know, Joe, that could be in question here are including declaring Anthropic a supply chain risk or even, according to Axios, invoking the Defense Production Act to force the company to tailor its models to the military's needs.
The CEO at Anthropic, Dario Amodei, has spoken eloquently and in some cases in a very scary fashion about the risks and the challenges that AI brings to the table here. And this is for him a moral question about using the technology for mass surveillance or for human-free weapons, autonomous weaponry. And this is the conversation, apparently a very tense meeting with Hegseth. He's got till Friday now knowing, and this is important, as the New York Times scoop today, Grok has been cleared, the XAI tool, to be used in classified systems. So there could be a replacement if Anthropic is shown the door here. And it's where we start our conversation with one of the most important minds in the business on this technology. Gregory Allen is back, a senior advisor at the Wadhwani AI Center at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I will remind you, he was director of strategy and policy at the Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center and would have been in the room for this meeting if he still had that job today. It's great to have you back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Great to be here.
I don't want to turn you into someone who needs to make moral judgment on the air, but talk to us about how important it is to have this access and what exactly the Pentagon is doing with this software. We're not at the point of having human-free weapons. What is Pete Hegseth asking Anthropic to do?
Well, I think there's a few things worth unpacking here. The first of which is that unclassified DoD military computer networks Claude is the only active AI model that is really already providing meaningful military and intelligence advantage using advanced AI capabilities. For example, we've seen in reporting by the Wall Street Journal that the raid on Maduro was enabled by offensive cyber capabilities that would not have been possible had Claude not been involved, had Anthropic not been involved. And since Anthropic won that $200 million contract to work with the Department of Defense, they have been leaning forward among all the frontier AI companies in most aggressively supporting national security. So this dispute comes at an awkward time because on the one hand, the user base within the Department of Defense loves Anthropic, loves Claude, and says that their restrictions on usage, at least from the conversations that I have been having, have never been triggered. There has never been a time where Anthropic said no. And it's worth pointing out that when Anthropic first negotiated this contract back in July 2025, the DoD was comfortable with a much longer set of restrictions than what Anthropic is asking for right now. They have already walked back so many of their requests. Now all they're saying is, we don't want our tool being used for mass domestic surveillance, and we don't want our tools being used for autonomous lethal weapons without a human on the loop. That's a pretty modest set of requests. And the DoD views that as so unreasonable that they're now threatening to designate Anthropic a supply chain risk, which is a dramatic escalation.
So do you think it's unreasonable? Would this severely hamper the ability of the DoD to keep the country safe?
So to be fair to the DoD, what they're saying is they want a contract that requires Anthropic to make their tools available for all lawful uses. Now, why might they want that? You can understand that the DoD, when lives are on the line, when national security is on the line, they do not want to be having a debate with their company providers about, can we use it for this? Can we use it for that? They need flexibility, and I understand that. However, the DoD already agreed to a much more restrictive set of terms back in July 2025. And so while I'm sympathetic to the DoD in saying it needs flexibility in these contract terms, what I think is an unreasonable escalation is threatening to designate Anthropic as a supply chain risk. That's what we do when we find out companies are secretly have Chinese or Russian ownership. To take a domestic AI champion at a time when the White House is saying that the AI race with China is equivalent to the space race during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, you do not want to take one of the crown jewels of your industry and light it on fire over something like this. There is a better way to resolve this dispute than the absolute stance the administration is taking.
Well, this has been an incredible turn from 2018 when Google saw itself out here. Now these companies are breaking the door down to get in, or is Anthropic just the exception? Because Gemini's ready, XAI, or they're all ready to replace Anthropic at a moment's notice, it seems.
Yes, at least on unclassified military networks, all the leading U.S. model providers are already active on platforms like GenAI.mil. But where Anthropic really stands out is these enterprise coding capabilities. And through a partnership with Palantir, is made available to some of the most important use cases across the intelligence and warfighting communities. So Anthropic is right now delivering the best bang for buck. They're involved in the most high-profile operations. And so far, the user community really likes what they're getting and has said that since July 2025, they are not encountering these restrictions in a realistic scenario. Now, one thing I want to say about the use cases that Anthropic is currently negotiating around, for example, lethal autonomous weapons. It is true that that is a capability that Russia is operating right now in Ukraine with systems like the V2U unmanned drone that does operate autonomously, does use AI for lethal capabilities. So I can see why the DoD would say to a company, we don't want you to decide whether or not we can match the capabilities of our adversaries. That's a decision that we need to make. But as you're having that debate, do you really need to threaten to designate the company as a foreign, supply chain risk, or at least the equivalent of a foreign supply chain risk? There's a much better way to have this conversation.
Well, and just remind us, Gregory, what would happen if indeed Anthropic is given that designation? It goes far beyond just eliminating the contract with the DoD.
Yes, the biggest risk for Anthropic, which has a very large and rapidly growing base of commercial customers, billions of dollars of revenue every year, increasing exponentially every year. The big threat is not this $200 million DoD contract. The biggest threat of that supply chain risk designation is that it could prevent other companies that supply to the DoD from doing business with Anthropic. In a worst case scenario, that could make Anthropic a non-starter for a whole huge segment of the American economy and could be almost fatal to their business. And that's why I think you should not even be casually throwing around threats like that. If you're trying to get startups excited about working with the DoD, do you really want to tell them that if you even dip your toe in the water, we're going to grab you and pull you all the way in? That's not a great message to be sending.
Isn't that something? Let's zoom out for a moment here. You mentioned Palantir, and it has been wild just the last couple of weeks to watch the reaction in the markets from our vantage point here on Bloomberg, but even the conversation within the industry when it comes to agentic AI. We have written off entire industries since you last joined us, beginning with software.
Yes.
Now we're moving on to cyber. Now we're seeing Palantir fall out of bed because apparently this incredibly unique service that it once provided the Pentagon can be dreamt up by an AI bot overnight. Are we getting ahead of ourselves?
Well, you're asking me to draw out my old MBA experiences, not my public policy experiences, but I'm happy to go there. Let me just say that the software industry of the United States and China looks very different. And it's because the United States software industry has had a shortage of software engineers, which is why software as a service, as a business model, has been really attractive. In China, they have an abundance of software engineers. So there's not really a software as a service business model. In fact, most companies just have in-house developers who develop custom stuff just for them. So SaaS, like Salesforce, is practically non-existent in China, even though companies still perform those functions. Well, what if agentic AI makes the US software ecosystem look like the Chinese software ecosystem with an abundance of software engineers? So do you really need to pay Salesforce to use a tiny sliver of their service that isn't even customized for you when you can just bring in some agentic AI agents who can create the exact, perfect, highly customized set of software that everybody in your company wants to use? It could be a whole reorientation of the industry because that bottleneck might be broken.
So it sounds like you think that skepticism is warranted in this case. 2
I would
years
say
down
at
the
a
road.
minimum, every company needs to have a justification for how that tsunami is not going to drown them.
Well, and so it obviously raises massive questions for the labor market. We've had Fed governors left and right talking about this in recent weeks, that they don't even know how to properly assess what it's going to do to productivity, what it's going to do to the labor force. Lisa Cook suggested today she doesn't even know if monetary policy is a tool that is going to be able to offset what AI could do to the economy, which raises, putting your policy hat back on, what policy tools can do that? I would assume it has to come in the fiscal realm and from the government. So to do so, does President Trump need to get on this like tonight in the State of the Union to get ahead of this? Is it even possible still to be ahead of it?
I expect President Trump to have a very optimistic message about AI because this is a massive opportunity for productivity enhancement. This is equivalent to the invention of the tractor. But it's worth thinking about, if you've ever read the book The Grapes of Wrath, which is about farmers in that era experiencing mechanization, it was a really difficult time for them because that increase in productivity over the long term, that led to more economic growth, more jobs, but in different sectors.
Right.
The population of America's workforce that was working on farms was something like 1 out of every 3 laborers in the 1920s. Today, it's closer to 1 out of every 100, even though we produce way more food. Now, here's the thing. Humans in that story were able to go work in manufacturing sectors or in service sectors because they could retrain and go have skills that tractors didn't. But you know who didn't retrain to find new skills? Horses. And the population of work horses in the American economy went from tens of millions to effectively 0 because they could not retrain. There was no comparative advantage that they offered.
Yeah, I was just about
This
to
is
say.
the key question. Is AI a normal technology that is mostly about increasing the productivity of humans, or do we cross that threshold where AI can do everything that a human can do better and cheaper? Why would people be employing people? And if you listen to the leading lights of AI, including Dario Amodei, but including his compatriots at every other company, I think the skeptic of the group at this stage is the CEO of Google DeepMind, who is predicting we'll cross that threshold in 10 years. Right. Dario thinks we'll cross it in 18 to 24 months.
Do you go to bed at night thinking that you are working on the very technology then that will spell our demise?
There's a line that Jeff Bezos said in the rise of the Amazon as a book retailer, the earlier incarnation of Amazon. And what he said is that Amazon is not putting brick and mortar book companies out of business. The future is putting brick and mortar book companies out of business.
You're not
and
making
Amazon
us
is
feel
merely the herald of the future. And I think that there is, a real chance that AI actually meets all the hype, and we actually are living in that transformative moment. Wow. And it's crazy because every generation says that they're living through some radical transformative moment, but this one might really be different.
Okay, so for those who are driving in their car right now, listening or watching us on TV and thinking, oh my God, my job is not going to be safe, can you provide them any real reassurance if you're someone who works on spreadsheets all day or looks at legal paperwork? I mean, the kind of jobs that we're told artificial intelligence easily could replace.
So I would say you can sort of categorize jobs based on how difficult or easy it is to automate. It's not an accident that Claude Code is kind of the breakout moment for agentic AI. And that's true because the internet is full of extremely high quality training data, like everything on GitHub for here's how to do incredibly high quality coding work. But it's also that code is amenable to instant verification, which means that Claude can generate an answer and then run a test. Does this program actually do what I'm trying to get it to do? And that means it can generate its own training data by running these tens of millions of tests. But if you work in a field where there is not a lot of training data available on the internet, or it is not amenable to this automated testing, it's going to be a lot longer before that sort of thing can actually be automated. But over a 100-year time frame, it's very hard for me to say why anyone would be safe.
All right, Greg Allen, scaring us all from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks for being here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.